It has always appeared to me that the case which I have here set down was one of those in which the genius of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes shone with a cold and singular lustre, like a lantern held up in a fog. The affair was not attended by the physical dangers of some of our earlier adventures, nor did it shake the empire as did the business of the Bruce Partington plans. Yet for sheer intellectual strangeness, for the uncanny mingling of the commonplace with the grotesque, I can recall few which equal the case of the letter that screamed in the night. It was in the autumn of '89, a season of persistent drizzle and yellow fogs, when London lay beneath a pall as though the very sky had grown weary of its own smoke. I had resumed my bachelor quarters in Baker Street, my practice having dwindled to such an extent that I could spare more of my time to the absorbing privilege of watching Holmes at work. It was upon one of those dull, grey evenings when the street lamps glimmered faintly through the mist, and the omnibus horses steamed like spectres at the cab rank, that the chain of strange events was set in motion. Holmes lay at full length upon the sofa, his long, thin form coiled in his dressing gown, his eyes closed, and his hands pressed together beneath his chin. A black clay pipe protruded at a perilous angle from the corner of his mouth, and the room was already clouded with the pungent reek of strong tobacco. Across his knees was spread a thin sheaf of papers clamped together by a bulldog clip of brass, and one corner of the Times lay crumpled on the floor beneath his slippered foot. "You observe, Watson," said he suddenly without opening his eyes, "how the English climate conspires with the English temperament to produce both the London fog and the London newspaper." "I confess," said I, looking up from the medical journal which I had been feebly trying to read, "that I see the connection in the one, but scarcely in the other." Holmes removed the pipe, exhaled a slow wreath of smoke toward the ceiling, and permitted his eyes to flicker open with an air of tolerant amusement. "Pray, my dear fellow, consider it. The fog, that most insidious of all our atmospheric afflictions, is composed of innumerable tiny particles, each insignificant in itself, yet together producing a blanket through which the keenest eye may scarcely penetrate. The London newspaper operates upon the same principle. Here." He raised the crumpled sheet from the floor between his fingers. "Murder, scandal, bankruptcy, parliamentary wrangles, matrimonial advertisements and the football fixtures, all hurled together in one grey mass. The public, like the sun, is expected to shine through and make sense of it." "You have at least succeeded in finding something of interest," I remarked, for I had observed the bundle of papers upon his knee. "A trifle. The police, as usual, have contrived to walk past a puzzle without so much as a second glance." He tapped the bulldog clip. "The notes of Inspector Lestrade upon a most curious incident in Bloomsbury last night." "A case?" I cried, laying down my journal. "A potential case," said he. "At present it is merely an inexplicable occurrence which has resulted, rather inconveniently for the victim, in death. It may develop into something worthy of our attention. On the other hand, it may resolve itself into the dullest of all conclusions. A natural cause." "A death, you say? And Lestrade has been here?" "2 hours ago." Holmes yawned. "He has acquired of late the habit of submitting his more intricate failures to me at an earlier stage than was once the case. It is a mark of progress." "And you did not wake me?" I protested. "My dear Watson, when a man sleeps as resolutely as you do after one of Mrs. Hudson's sweet puddings, not even the trump of doom or Lestrade's boots would rouse him. Besides," he added, with a glint in his eye, "you would have gained nothing by it, for the inspector had little to offer beyond confusion and damp footprints." "Damp footprints?" Holmes stretched like a cat and rose from the sofa with that singular energy which he could summon at will from the depths of lassitude. Before I gratify your natural curiosity, allow me a little amusement of my own. You have had an eventful day." "On the contrary," said I, "it has been the dullest imaginable." Holmes wagged a long forefinger at me. "Come, come, Watson. The nick on your left cuff, the faint crease upon your right trouser knee, the indigo ink spot upon your thumb, the whiff of carbolic. No, do not look at your fingers, I have already done so, and the fact that your boots are still slightly damp at the instep, though the rest of your attire is dry. These things together proclaim your adventures to anyone who possesses a pair of eyes." I laughed. "If you can deduce a whole narrative from such scant data, I shall be properly humbled." "Nothing easier. You spent the late morning at your surgery in Paddington, where you were engaged with some troublesome paperwork, a matter of insurance, possibly, since you used more ink than the ordinary prescriptions require. About noon you received a message, doubtless by hand, calling you to a patient of some urgency, a child, I fancy. You took a hansom, hence the damp boots from stepping down into the gutter. At the patient's house, a modest one, for you knelt on a carpet that bears the imprint still, you administered some minor operation, perhaps the lancing of an abscess, hence the carbolic. You returned here not long after 3, to judge by the drying of the leather." "You are quite right in every particular," I admitted. "It was a boy with an infected knee, but surely you cannot distinguish between a boy and a girl by my cuff." "I did not attempt it," he replied coolly. "That part was conjecture, but justified. A grown man with an infected knee would not wait till the 11th hour to send for you. A child will scream and fret until the mother can bear it no longer. When one is allowed a little conjecture, one may sometimes appear almost human, Watson. Now to the matter in hand." He picked up the clipped papers and handed them to me. "Read that and tell me if the incident does not possess at least the outward appearance of the bizarre." The document consisted of several hastily written pages in Lestrade's cramped hand, evidently a preliminary report for his own use. I shall summarize its contents rather than reproduce them word for word. At about 1 o'clock that morning it stated, "The household of Sir Percival Harrowby, late of the Colonial Bar and now residing at number 37 Harrow Square, Bloomsbury, had been aroused by a sound so strange and terrible that even in the cold recital of the inspector's pen I felt a slight shiver. It was described as a long, piercing cry, rising and falling in a hideous wail, such as might have issued from the throat of a woman in mortal terror, or of a soul in torment, yet with something in it, something shriller and more metallic that was not quite human. The sound had seemed to come from Sir Percival's study on the first floor. His housekeeper, Mrs. Murch, and his manservant, Evans, had both rushed to the door almost simultaneously to find it locked on the inside. Before they could force an entrance, the cry had ceased abruptly. Evans then fetched a small hand-axe kept below stairs in case of fire, and with this they broke open the door. Sir Percival Harrowby was found seated at his writing table, his head thrown back, his eyes wide open and staring, his hands clenching the arms of the leather chair. A single sheet of notepaper lay upon the blotting pad before him, but it was entirely blank. On the floor at his feet, crumpled and torn, was the remains of an envelope. The window behind his chair stood open upon the dark square, though the night had been raw and drizzling. There was, however, no sign that anyone had passed either into or out of the room. The local doctor, a certain Mr. Gilray, had been summoned at once. He could find no mark of violence upon the body, nor any sign of poison. The heart, of which Sir Percival had long complained, was considerably diseased, and the medical man had therefore given it as his opinion that death was due to sudden cardiac failure brought on by some violent shock. "That sounds sufficiently commonplace," I remarked, looking up. "Pray read on," said Holmes. The oddity lay in the matter of the cry. Not only had the two servants heard it distinctly, but also the housemaid on the second floor and a constable on his beat at the corner of the square. The latter described it as like a woman screaming in a railway tunnel. The sound had lasted, by their unanimous account, for a good 10 or 12 seconds, a long-drawn wail with a curious throbbing and harshness at the height of it. Yet when they had burst into the study, Sir Percival's lips were rigid and colourless, and there was not the slightest sign that any human throat in that house had given forth such a noise. "Could it not have been a cry from the street?" I suggested. "The constable is explicit upon that point," Holmes replied. "He states that it came from the direction of Sir Percival's window, which, as you observe, was open. Moreover, the square was at that hour almost deserted. No, Watson, the cry, whatever its nature, proceeded from that room and from nowhere else." I resumed the report. The house had been searched from attic to cellar. No intruder was discovered, nor any instrument which might account for the uncanny sound. Sir Percival had retired to his study shortly after 10, according to his invariable habit, and had instructed that he was not to be disturbed. He was last seen alive by Mrs. Murch at 10:30, when she brought him his glass of hot milk, a detail upon which Lestrade had underlined twice, and at that time there had been nothing in his manner to excite alarm. The envelope upon the floor was of cheap blue-grey paper, such as is sold in packets at stationers' shops. It bore a London postmark of the previous afternoon, and was addressed in a firm, upright hand, Sir Percival Harrowby, 37 Harrow Square, W.C. The stamp had already been removed, doubtless by the servants. Of the letter itself, if letter it could be called, there was only that blank sheet upon the table, folded once. There was no signature, no writing, no watermark, beyond the trivial initials of a local maker. Lestrade noted, finally, that there were some small scraps of paper adhering to Sir Percival's right hand, as though he had torn open the envelope with considerable violence. A smear of black grease or oil had been observed upon one corner of the torn paper, but this might have come from the grate or from the manservant's hands in the confusion. At the conclusion of the report, Lestrade had scribbled in the margin, "Death from natural causes, but what of the scream? Possible street disturbance. Will interview neighbours." Below this, in another hand, and this I recognised instantly as Holmes's own, were the words, "The scream did not proceed from a human throat." I laid the papers down. "You have written that," said I, pointing. "Surely, Holmes, that is a very bold assertion." "Upon what do you base it?" "Upon 3 lines of the inspector's report, and upon the nature of things," he answered. "You observe that the cry was heard not merely by those in the house, but by a constable in the open air. It lasted, by all accounts, for 10 seconds at the least, and perhaps more. Now, Watson, have you ever known a terrified man or woman taken unawares to emit a single, continuous scream of that duration?" "I confess I have not," I said. "In battle and in hospital, one hears sharp, broken cries rather than a sustained one. Precisely, the lungs will not permit it, nor will the nerves. The cry of real terror is spasmodic. But here we have a sound long-drawn, sustained, throbbing. It is the quality of a whistle or a steam siren, rather than of a living voice. That alone would incline one to suspect an artificial origin. Add to it the curious metallic timbre of which the constable speaks, and the fact that no sign of exertion appears about Sir Percival's throat or jaw, and the case becomes stronger still. You think, then, that some instrument was used?" "I do not think, Watson. I am certain. The inspector's dull mind has passed over the one truly important phrase in his own account." "And which is that?" He took the sheets from my hand and tapped them with a bony finger. A smear of black grease or oil upon one corner of the torn paper. There, my dear fellow, speaks the criminal. Ink may find its way upon a letter. Grease does not, save where there is machinery. Machinery? I exclaimed. But what form of machinery could be concealed within a letter? Holmes's eyes had taken on that cold, grey light, which I had learned to recognize as the herald of his keenest mental activity. That, Watson, is the very question which interests me. If there is a device which can cause a sealed envelope to emit a scream heard through half a square, then we are face to face with an invention at once diabolical and ingenious. If such a device were placed in the wrong hands— He broke off, and a shadow of distaste passed over his hawk-like features. But I anticipate. At present we know only that a man, already in delicate health, received a letter of peculiar construction, and that shortly afterwards he is found dead, while a monstrous cry, not human, and not easily accounted for, rings out in the night. Lestrade is content with natural causes. I am not. You think, then, that Sir Percival was murdered? I think he was killed, said Holmes gravely. Whether we can justify the harsher word remains to be seen. There is, you perceive, as yet no tangible proof that another hand set the machinery in motion. The law, which moves by precedent and not by reason, would shrug its shoulders. But the facts, Watson, the facts are ugly. He moved to the window and drew back the blind. Outside, Baker Street lay under a shroud of mist, the gas lamps glowing like dull orange moons. You have no case at present, I objected. Lestrade has not asked for your assistance. Holmes smiled thinly. My dear fellow, when a man of Lestrade's experience brings me his notes unbidden and complains that he can make neither head nor tail of them, I take it as a tacit invitation. He has gone now to interview the neighbours. He will return more perplexed than ever within the hour. And we? We shall be beforehand with him, said Sherlock Holmes, snatching his overcoat and thrusting his long arms into the sleeves. It is not often that a letter screams in the night and leaves behind it a dead judge and a smear of oil. Such phenomena are not to be neglected. Come, Watson, Harrow Square is but a short drive from here, and I shall be vastly surprised if the study of Sir Percival Harrowby does not repay our attention. 5 minutes later, we were rattling through the wet streets in a hansom, the horses' hoofs striking sparks from the greasy stones, while the mist closed in around us like a living thing. Holmes sat silent at my side, his chin sunk upon his breast, his eyes half closed, yet I knew well that behind that mask of abstraction his mind raced ahead of the jolting cab, leaping from clue to inference as a hound follows an invisible scent. Of the strange house in Harrow Square, of the dead man in the leather chair, and of the crumpled, greasy fragment of blue-grey envelope upon the floor, I had as yet formed no clear mental picture. I little guessed, as we drove deeper into the yellow gloom, that this inexplicable screaming letter would draw us into a web of deception so artfully spun that even I, who have watched Holmes unravel many a tangled skein, should more than once be prepared to swear that we were upon an entirely false scent. Of the strange house in Harrow Square, I had formed in my mind the picture of some gloomy, ivy-draped mansion such as one sees in the older parts of Bloomsbury. Nor was I altogether wrong. The cab drew up before a dingy terrace, the paint peeling from the iron railings and the stone steps glistening with moisture. Number 37 loomed above us, its upper windows already dark, while a faint glow from the fanlight over the door showed that some portion of the household was yet astir. A constable stood upon the step, his cape beaded with rain. He straightened as we alighted, peering at us with that dull suspicion which officialdom reserves for the unexpected. "Now then, sir," he began. Holmes had his card case out before the man could complete the sentence. "You have Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard in charge of this case," said he, in his driest professional tone. "He has requested my assistance. Kindly announce to the household that Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson have arrived." There was that in his carriage which few policemen could resist. The constable glanced at the card, then at Holmes's gaunt, eager face, and his manner altered at once. "Beg pardon, sir. We was told you might come. Mrs. Murch is within. Will you step inside, gentlemen?" We passed into a narrow, rather mean passage, lit by a single oil lamp. The air smelt of dust and cabbage water, with a faint undertone of something more pungent. Ether, or some other medical spirit, I thought, which lingered like a memory of the previous night's drama. A stout, grey-haired woman in a black dress appeared at the door of what I took to be the kitchen. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her manner had in it that curious mixture of respectability and curiosity which I have often observed in housekeepers suddenly plunged into notoriety. "Mrs. Murch," said Holmes, inclining his head, "this is Dr. Watson. We come at the request of Inspector Lestrade." "Yes, sir. The inspector said as how you might be calling. It's a dreadful business, sir. Most dreadful after all these years in service." Her voice quavered, but she drew herself up with an air of prim self-control. "You'll be wishful to see the study, no doubt?" "At once, if you please," said Holmes. "Afterwards, I shall trouble you for a few particulars." We mounted the stairs, the boards creaking beneath our steps. On the first landing, she opened a door to the right and stood aside for us to enter. The room into which we passed was of moderate size, with a single large window looking out upon the square. Bookcases lined two of the walls, their shelves filled in orderly ranks. A Turkey carpet of sober pattern covered the floor, and a massive writing table stood near the window with a high-backed leather chair pushed close into it. The fire had been allowed to go out. The grate showed only a dull, reddish heap of embers. A shaded lamp upon the desk cast a circle of yellow light, leaving the corners of the room in gloom. "There, gentlemen," said Mrs. Murch in a hushed voice, "is where we found him. Poor Sir Percival. Just as you see the chair now. They took him away about 10 this morning. Evans, he's in the pantry if you require him. Will you be wanting me further?" "In a moment," Holmes replied. "Be so good as to remain within call." As the door closed behind her, he shot me a swift, keen glance and then moved noiselessly into the centre of the room. I could see the familiar transformation upon him. The drooping languor of Baker Street was gone, and in its place there stood the true Holmes, alert, hawk-like, every faculty braced. "You perceive, Watson," said he softly, "that our good Lestrade has obeyed his instincts and touched nothing which he did not absolutely have to. For once, his inertia is an advantage." The writing table was in some disarray. A large leather blotting pad occupied the centre. Upon it lay the single sheet of folded notepaper which had figured in the inspector's report. Beside it stood an inkstand of cut glass, a steel pen, and a small rack of envelopes and paper. A few books lay open, law reports, if I judged rightly, and a heavy silver paper knife gleamed across the margin of one of them. Holmes circled the chair, stooping to examine the carpet behind it. "Observe," said he. "The position of the chair is slightly askew from the line of the desk. It has been thrust back, not drawn forward. Our man, let us still call him that, was startled, and his impulse was to throw himself away from the sound rather than toward it. The scream, then, came not from the door, but from the direction of the window, or of the table itself. He bent to the floor at the foot of the chair. There, half under the lowest rung, lay a small, crumpled mass which I recognized at once as the remains of the envelope. Holmes drew a pair of thin gloves from his pocket and delicately lifted it. "Ah," he murmured. "Lestrade has at least had the sense to preserve this." Even to my untrained eye, the thing was curious. It had been torn into several jagged pieces which still clung together at one corner. That corner was smeared with a dark, viscous substance, shiny even in the lamplight. Holmes brought it close to his aquiline nose and sniffed delicately, his eyes half closed. "Not lamp-black," he said. "Not ordinary machine oil. There is a faint aromatic tang, fennel, possibly, or some allied compound. Curious, Watson, curious. And you will note that the paper is slightly stiffened along this edge, as if it had been glued or gummed to some foreign body. You think, then, that there was something more than a letter in that envelope?" "I am sure of it. Look at the crease here and here. The fold is not such as one makes with a simple sheet of paper. There was weight, bulk, within. Something narrow, perhaps metallic, which has since been removed, or has fallen elsewhere." He stooped again and scrutinized the carpet fibre by fibre, moving with a patience that has always excited my admiration. Presently he gave a little exclamation, and with the point of his penknife detached from the pile a minute object no larger than a grain of rice. It glittered in the lamplight as he turned it in his fingers. "What do you make of that, Watson?" It was a tiny fragment of steel, curved slightly and sharpened to a fine bevel at one edge, as though it had formed part of a spring or wheel. "Part of a watch, perhaps?" I hazarded. "Possibly, or of some other delicate mechanism. In any case, we may already say with confidence that the envelope once contained machinery, a letter that screams, what is that, Watson, but a machine which converts some stored energy into a violent disturbance of the air? The energy, once expended, leaves behind only such traces as this." He placed both the fragment of steel and the envelope in his pocketbook, and then turned his attention to the window. It was a tall sash, with heavy curtains drawn back upon either side. The lower half was raised some 10 inches, admitting a faint draught of damp air. Holmes examined the sill minutely, then leaned out, his lean figure outlined against the pale glow of the square. "The sill is moist," he remarked, drawing in again. "There has been condensation here for some hours. Our man sat with the window open a considerable time before his death. A chilly habit, Watson, for a gentleman with a weak heart." "Perhaps he found the room close," I suggested. "Or perhaps he wished any unusual sound to pass more readily to the street," said Holmes. "A man in fear sometimes takes strange precautions. You think, then, that Sir Percival was expecting such a letter?" Holmes did not reply at once. He had moved to the door and was examining the lock and the portion of the panel which had been splintered by Evans's axe. The key still protruded from the inner side of the lock. "The door was locked," he said slowly, "and the key within." "That we knew. But observe the scratches about the wards of the key. They are fresh, and they are upon the side turned toward the interior, not the corridor. Sir Percival had locked himself in, and afterwards, from within the study, some hand fumbled with the key, clumsily, as though unaccustomed to such a lock, or in great agitation. Yet the door was not unlocked. Why, then, the fumbling? Could it have been he himself in his last moments? Holmes shrugged those gaunt shoulders. Possible. But the chair, the position of the body, the scraps of envelope clutched in the hand, these things suggest a man whose powers were concentrated on what lay before him on the desk, not on the door behind. No, Watson, there is here some small discord in the facts, and small discords are often the prelude to a very large revelation. He turned once more to the table, running his gaze rapidly over its surface. "Where are the matches?" he asked suddenly. "The matches?" Surely he did not light his lamp by miracle, Mrs. Murch. The housekeeper appeared almost instantly, as though she had been listening outside. You rang, sir? Pray be seated, Mrs. Murch. Sir Percival was in the habit of working late, I understand. Where did he keep his matches? There, sir, in that little silver box by the lamp. He was very particular about it. No paper spills, Murch, he would say. They litter the place. The box is empty, said Holmes, shaking it gently. It was filled yesterday evening? Yes, sir, I filled it myself at tea time. Ah, and who besides yourself and Evans had access to this room? No one, sir. Sir Percival kept it locked when he was out. When he was in, we never disturbed him unless he rang. Holmes regarded her fixedly for an instant. Tell me, Mrs. Murch, had your master been more than usually anxious of late? Had he spoken of any trouble? The woman hesitated, twisting her hands in her apron. Well, sir, he was always a bit short in his manner, begging your pardon, and easily put out. But these last few weeks he had been that restless, walking up and down of nights, and once I heard him talking to himself, quite fierce-like. Evans, he said, as how it was the colonial cases preying on his mind again. Colonial cases? Yes, sir. From when he sat out yonder, India way or some such, passing judgment on natives. They don't forget, he said once when I took him his milk. They never forget. It gave me quite a turn, sir, the way he looked at me. Thank you, Mrs. Murch. That will do for the present. I may trouble you further. Send Evans to us. When she had gone, I could not restrain my impatience. Well, Holmes, I cried, what do you gather from all this? He sank into the dead man's chair, his long fingers pressed together, his eyes half closed in that cataleptic attitude which meant that his mind was working at its highest pitch. We have advanced, Watson, said he quietly, from complete darkness to a very interesting twilight. We know now that Sir Percival had enemies in the colonies who, in his own words, do not forget, that he anticipated some form of attack and yet chose to face it alone, that the vehicle of that attack was a most ingenious mechanical device concealed within a letter, and that whoever sent it possesses no ordinary knowledge of chemistry and acoustics. The screaming of the letter killed the judge. The question before us is, who taught the letter to scream? As he spoke, there came a heavy step upon the stair, and the rasp of a familiar voice in the passage. That, said Holmes with a thin smile, will be Lestrade, armed with his neighbour's gossip. Let us see how much of our twilight he is prepared to accept as daylight. Lestrade entered with that oddly stiff gait of his coat collar sprinkled with moisture, and his bowler hat tucked beneath his arm. His sharp little eyes darted at once from Holmes to me, then to the disordered desk and the fragments of envelope Holmes had so carefully avoided mentioning. "Ah, thought I'd find you poking about here," he said, with an attempt at geniality that did not quite conceal his irritation. "I've been canvassing the square, Mr. Holmes, and I can tell you the neighbours heard precious little beyond that awful shriek. No sign of any suspicious characters lurking about. No stray cabbies remembering mysterious fares, and nothing at all to suggest foul play." Holmes regarded him with that expression of weary tolerance which he reserved especially for Lestrade. "Indeed?" he said quietly. "And yet you yourself described the cry as metallic and inhuman." Lestrade coloured slightly. "I said it sounded odd, Mr. Holmes, nothing more. These old houses creak and groan something dreadful in the night. Echoes roll about a square in ways no man can rightly account for. And Sir Percival's heart was in a shocking state. Dr. Gilray is positive it was a seizure." "Perhaps," murmured Holmes, "but seizures do not generally dismantle envelopes." Lestrade blinked. "Dismantle?" Holmes withdrew from his pocketbook the tiny steel fragment he had discovered and held it out upon his palm. Part of a delicate mechanism, Lestrade. One which, I venture to think, was contained within the letter Sir Percival received last night. The inspector peered at it, frowning. That might be from anything. A clock, a watch, something Evans dropped. Evans has strong, clumsy hands, Holmes interrupted. This fragment bears the fine workmanship of a craftsman, and note that it was embedded in the carpet directly beneath the chair in which Sir Percival died. Had it fallen at any earlier time, Mrs. Murch would have swept it up in one of her assiduous tidying campaigns. No, this steel sliver belongs to last night and to nothing else. Lestrade took a long breath through his nose. And what if it does, Mr. Holmes? The doctor says the man died of fright. A sudden shock. Nothing to contradict that. Holmes rose from the chair with a certain slow grace and moved to the window. Lestrade, he said, in that tone which I knew was as good as an order. Step here, if you please. The inspector obeyed reluctantly. Observe the window-sill, Holmes continued. Moist for hours, Sir Percival sat at this desk with the window open in the chill of the night. Not a common preference for a man with weak lungs. Well, perhaps nothing, said Holmes curtly. Sir Percival was expecting something. Whether a visitor, a sound, or a signal, he wished the air between himself and the street unobstructed. A man in dread, Lestrade, takes precautions. And he was in dread. Of what? Holmes turned to him with a gleam in his eye. Of retribution. Retribution? Lestrade gasped. You mean one of his old colonial cases? Holmes inclined his head slightly. You have heard, no doubt, of certain judges in India whose sentences were not well received by the aggrieved parties. Sir Percival seems to have been one of those unfortunate magistrates whose decisions, though legal, left bitter scars. He admitted as much, according to Mrs. Murch. Before Lestrade could reply, the door opened, and Evans, the manservant, stepped in. He was a thin, hollow-checked fellow, his black suit slightly too loose for his frame, his hands knotted together nervously. "You wish to speak to me, sir?" he asked, looking from Holmes to Lestrade. "Yes," said Holmes, motioning him forward. "You were the first to reach the door last night, I believe?" "Yes, sir. Mrs. Murch was right behind me. I was coming up the stairs when I heard that terrible cry, like nothing human, sir. I ran to the study door and found it locked. Sir Percival always kept it locked at night." "And you used the axe to gain entry?" "Yes, sir. It took 3 blows. The moment the door gave, the cry had ceased." Holmes watched him closely. "And before coming upstairs, Evans, where were you?" "In the pantry, sir. I was cleaning the supper things. We had finished nearly an hour before." "You heard nothing before the cry?" "Nothing, sir. It was deadly still." Holmes paced a short distance away, then returned. "Evans, did your master receive letters frequently of late?" "Yes, sir. More than usual, I'd say. Mostly official business, but some with foreign stamps. He did not like us to handle those. Said they were personal." Holmes gave me a brief, meaningful glance. "And last night? Did he appear anxious, preoccupied?" Evans hesitated. "Well, sir, he was always a bit on edge these days, but after supper, when he went up to the study, he told me not to disturb him on any account. He didn't usually say that unless he expected to work very late." "Did he ring for the hot milk, or did Mrs. Murch take it up at the usual hour?" "She took it up, sir. He didn't care for us to break his routine." Holmes tapped his fingers against his chin. "You mentioned that he kept the foreign letters from you. Did you ever see one, even by accident?" Evans swallowed and nodded. "Only once. He'd left one upon the hall table when he came in one evening. I picked it up to place with the rest, and he snatched it from my hand as though it had burned him." Did you note the handwriting? Oh, yes, sir. Strange, upright, and the letters slanted oddly, as though the writer were not used to our alphabet. Holmes's eyes brightened. And the paper? Thin, bluish-grey. Holmes gave a quiet exhalation of satisfaction. You have been most helpful, Evans. You may go. When the door closed behind the man, Lestrade turned sharply upon Holmes. You don't mean, he burst out, that someone from the colonies sent him what? A mechanical death trap, through the post? Holmes resumed his lean, thoughtful posture, his hands clasped behind him as he paced slowly across the carpet. It is no more improbable than a poisoned pin or a box of cigars steeped in prussic acid, he replied calmly. The world is not short of inventive malice, and if the sender wished to terrify rather than directly poison, the device would be chosen to attack the nerves. Sir Percival had long-standing heart trouble. A sufficiently violent shock produced, say, by an unexpected and hideous shriek could be fatal. Lestrade shook his head, still unconvinced. But how could such a thing even be built? Ah! Holmes stopped dead and pointed toward the fragments of envelope. That is the very question I intend to answer. He turned suddenly toward the desk, where the blank sheet of notepaper lay, the lamp casting its steady glow upon its unmarred surface. Holmes took it up delicately. You see, Watson, he said, this paper is perfectly ordinary, yet there is a faint indentation near the centre. Look at the texture. I leaned in. There was indeed a slight depression, almost imperceptible, as though something narrow and rigid had pressed against the sheet from beneath. What do you infer? I asked. That the letter was folded over a small object, likely a chamber or casing. The scream would have to be produced by a rapidly vibrating reed or whistle, activated perhaps by tension released when the seal was broken. The oil upon the envelope points to moving parts. Lestrade muttered, a clockwork whistle? Activated by opening the envelope, it sounds like something from a penny dreadful. Holmes smiled thinly. The world, my dear Lestrade, is forever striving to imitate fiction, but fiction, in turn, must bow to fact. He replaced the sheet carefully and stepped back, surveying the room once more. There is one point, he murmured, one point which troubles me. If Sir Percival feared an attack, why open the letter alone? Why not call Evans or Mrs. Murch, unless he wished to face it alone, or believed he must? Before Lestrade or I could answer, a sharp knock sounded on the doorframe. The constable we had encountered below stood there, breath slightly quickened from haste. Beg pardon, gentlemen, but there's a lad downstairs, errand boy from the telegraph office, says he has a message for Sir Percival Harrowby, marked urgent. Holmes's face sharpened instantly. Bring it here. Moments later, the boy entered, cap in hand, glancing nervously about the study. He handed Holmes a folded sheet, stamped with the familiar markings of the telegraph service. Holmes flicked it open. I saw his brows rise a fraction. Well? Demanded Lestrade. Without a word, Holmes handed it to me. The message was short, startlingly so. He was warned. The second follows. Midnight. There was no signature, no address besides that of Sir Percival, and the time-stamp showed it had been filed scarcely 20 minutes earlier, long after news of the judge's death might have spread within official circles, but far too soon for any common gossip to have carried it. Lestrade stared. Second what? Holmes's voice was low, taut. A second letter. My heart gave a jolt. And if the first screamed, Holmes continued grimly, there is every likelihood the second will do worse. We have little time. Midnight approaches. Lestrade paled. But to whom will it be sent? Holmes looked toward the window, into the gathering dark beyond. That, Lestrade, he said quietly, is the question that will either save a life or cost one. The room seemed to hush around us. The faint ticking of the mantel clock sounded louder than before. Holmes straightened suddenly, all alert purpose. "We must return to Baker Street at once. There are inquiries to be made, records to be consulted, and a pattern to be discerned before midnight. Come, Watson." And as we followed him out into the fog-bound night, I felt with sudden certainty that the case had deepened from peculiar tragedy into something infinitely more sinister, something that was already moving, unseen, toward its next victim. The cab that bore us away from Harrow Square clattered over the cobbles with a haste that matched Holmes's own mental agitation. He leaned forward, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes gleaming with that peculiar fire I had come to recognize as the herald of a breakthrough or of peril fast approaching. Lestrade sat opposite, us gripping the strap above him, clearly unsettled by both the telegram and Holmes's silence. "You believe this message genuine?" I ventured at last. "Completely," Holmes said without turning his head. "Its brevity, its timing, and its confidence are marks of authenticity. A hoaxer would trumpet details, the true villain whispers." Lestrade made a faint sound of frustration. "But who would send such a message now? The man's already dead." "That may be," Holmes said, "but the sender does not know what we know, Lestrade. He seeks to terrify, to demonstrate his reach, to show that Sir Percival's warnings were not the imaginings of a troubled mind." "And this second the telegram speaks of?" I asked quietly. "That," Holmes said, turning his thin, hawk-like face toward me, "is what we must decipher before midnight." He tapped the side of the cab impatiently, urging the driver to greater speed. When at last we reached Baker Street, Holmes bounded from the cab almost before it had halted, striding up the steps 2 at a time. Mrs. Hudson, startled by the haste of our arrival, barely had time to retreat as Holmes swept into the sitting room and lit the gas with 2 swift motions. "Watson, my notes. The ledger marked Colonial Judiciary Correspondence. Quickly." I knew the volume well. Holmes kept it among a peculiar assortment of files concerning foreign cases, notable trials and obscure political quarrels, subjects which, to me, appeared disconnected, but which to him formed a vast web of human motives. I retrieved it at once and placed it before him. Lestrade dropped into a chair. "You mean to say you keep records of judges now?" "Of judges," Holmes replied without looking up. "Politicians, jewel thieves, revolutionaries, poets, and professional poisoners. Every occupation, Lestrade, creates enemies. A man's life is often written in the list of those who wish him harm." His long fingers skimmed the pages with astonishing speed, pausing only when a name or date caught his eye. At last he found what he sought. "Here," he murmured. "Sir Percival Harrowby, colonial magistrate, served in Bengal, 15 years abroad, notoriously severe judgments in 3 notable trials, 2 acquittals overturned by his insistence, 1 man sentenced to death against the recommendation of the court." Lestrade leaned forward. "And you think one of those men, or their families, sent that contraption?" Holmes shook his head sharply. "No, Lestrade. Those who seek revenge after many years do not announce their intentions. They strike silently. A personal vendetta seldom declares itself, but this is theatrical, calculated, the work not of a grieving relative, but of a mind that delights in fear itself." He turned the page and tapped a line with the tip of his nail. "Ah, this is interesting, very interesting indeed." I leaned over his shoulder and read the name he indicated. "Arun Varma," Holmes said softly. "Engineer, artificer of mechanical devices. tried for constructing infernal machines later outlawed by the Indian administration. He defended himself brilliantly at trial, but was convicted on charges of dangerous experimentation. Sir Percival presided. Lestrade's eyes widened. Machines? You think this fellow built the screaming letter? Holmes snapped the ledger shut. It is a possibility, no more, but note the congruence of skills. A man who devises small mechanical engines capable of producing violent noise or combustion, and a judge who sent him to prison. Not a coincidence easily dismissed. But Varma, I said, would scarcely remain in England. Would he not have returned to India? Perhaps, Holmes replied. Or perhaps he remained precisely where his enemies least expected him. We shall know soon enough. A knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered timidly. Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, but a messenger has just arrived with a parcel addressed to you. Holmes whirled around. To me? Yes, sir. It's small, sir, wrapped in brown paper. Lestrade half rose from his chair. A parcel? Now? After that telegram? Holmes, don't touch it. But Holmes had already crossed the room. The parcel lay upon the table, no larger than a cigar box, tied with coarse string. He bent close, examining it without touching. The handwriting, murmured Holmes. Watson, note the upright strokes, the peculiar slant, identical to Evans's description of the foreign letters Sir Percival received. Lestrade's voice cracked. Then it is the second. Holmes straightened abruptly. No, the telegram said the second follows it. This is not the second, it is something else. But why send it to you? I asked. Holmes's expression darkened. Because the sender knows the first has failed to reach its intended effect. He seeks to warn me off, Watson, to frighten me. Lestrade swallowed. Well, will you open it? Holmes gave a thin, cold smile. With the utmost care. From his drawer he retrieved a small blade and gently sliced through the string. He unfolded the brown paper layer by layer, each movement delicate, measured. Inside lay a wooden box of dark, polished teak, the sort one might find in an Indian bazaar. A faint, resinous scent rose from it. Holmes placed his ear near the box. No ticking, no vibration. If this hides a mechanism, it is either dormant or exceedingly well made. He lifted the lid a hair's breadth, just enough to glimpse inside. A note, he said quietly. And nothing more? Relief swept visibly across Lestrade's face. Holmes lifted the note with his fingertips and read aloud. Do not pursue the matter of the first. The second is already chosen. Watson. The name was written beneath, in an elegant, flowing script. My breath caught in my throat. Holmes's eyes shot to mine, and for the briefest instant I saw something in them I had only once before witnessed, the flash of personal alarm. Lestrade gasped. Good Lord, they mean to target you, Doctor. Holmes crushed the note between his fingers. No, this is another illusion, a threat meant to unbalance us. The true target will receive their letter before midnight, and it will not be Watson. But how can you be sure? Holmes strode to the window and flung it open, letting the cold night air pour in. Because Watson is too obvious a choice, our adversary delights in the unexpected, in the theatrical. No, he will choose someone who does not even know he is in danger. He turned sharply. Lestrade, how quickly can you obtain a list of Sir Percival's closest legal associates, clients and correspondents in London? Within the hour. Then do so. Bring it here immediately. Lestrade hurried out at once, leaving Holmes standing tense and motionless by the window. Holmes, I said quietly, if the second letter is meant to kill... He cut me off. It is meant to kill, Watson, and unless we identify the intended recipient before the hour strikes, London shall wake to another corpse. The clock on the mantel chimed the quarter hour, each note sounding like a countdown. Holmes turned from the window, his face pale with resolve. "We have less than 3 hours," he said, "and an enemy who has already shown he is 2 steps ahead." He reached for his violin, not to play, but to tap the bow lightly against the strings, his habit when assembling the final, elusive pieces of a puzzle. "Watson," he murmured, "this night will end in revelation, or catastrophe." Holmes remained rigid for a moment, the bow poised against the violin strings as though the faint vibration might shake loose, the critical thought eluding him. Then, with a sudden movement, he set both instrument and bow aside and crossed briskly to his writing desk. "We must approach this with method," he said sharply. "Our adversary is meticulous, every action timed, every threat calculated. Therefore we must determine where his plan is vulnerable." I watched him draw out a sheet of foolscap and begin sketching a rough diagram. Sir Percival at the centre, lines radiating outward to various names and dates extracted from the ledger. Each he circled or crossed out with ruthless economy. "You believe the intended victim must be connected to Sir Percival in some direct manner?" I asked. Holmes did not look up. "Not merely connected, integral. The second act of any performance is shaped by the first. Whoever sent the screaming letter sought not merely death, but demonstration. He wishes to show that Sir Percival's fate was no accident." "And the purpose of the box addressed to you?" "A distraction," Holmes said curtly. "A warning designed to make us look inward when we should be looking outward. Our adversary fears I may perceive the true pattern. Before he completes it—" A knock sounded below. Quick footsteps mounted the stairs. Lestrade burst into the room, breathless, his coat half unbuttoned. "I've brought the list," he said, thrusting several papers into Holmes's hands. "Clerks are working on more, but these are the closest. His assistant magistrates, colleagues at the bar, old associates from India, and 2 men he'd corresponded with frequently this past year." Holmes seized the pages and spread them across the table. "Excellent. Watson, read aloud that list of correspondence." I took up the nearest sheet. Sir Gilbert Rowan, retired judge of the Bombay High Court. Nathaniel Brackley, solicitor, Lincoln's Inn. A Major, Roderick Sherrin, pensioned from the Indian Army. And, Holmes, here is one more, Mr. Julian Ainsworth, translator and expert in Eastern dialects. Holmes's eyes flickered. "Ainsworth. Curious, I recall the name in connection with some obscure linguistic controversies. Did he and Sir Percival maintain regular correspondence?" "So it appears," I said. "Lestrade's sheet marks their letters as frequent and recent." Holmes's fingers drummed against the table. "What do we know of him?" Lestrade shrugged. "Respectable enough. Lives in Bloomsbury, close to Sir Percival, as it happens. Gives lectures on comparative scripts. Mild fellow by all accounts." Holmes turned sharply toward him. "A man who handles unfamiliar alphabets, foreign inks, delicate charts. One whose work demands precise instruments and knowledge of exotic languages. Tell me, Lestrade, does such a man seem likely to have passed unnoticed by our enemy's eyes, or avoided knowledge of Sir Percival's colonial controversies?" Lestrade rubbed the back of his neck uneasily. "You don't think he's involved?" "I think he is important," Holmes replied, "either as target or as pawnbroker in this deadly game." The clock chimed the half-hour. Holmes straightened. "We go to Ainsworth at once." Without waiting for Lestrade to finish fastening his coat, Holmes swept from the room, and we followed him down the stairs into the night. Fog pressed thick against the windows of the hansom as we drove into Bloomsbury, the lamps throwing trembling halos onto the damp air. "Ainsworth Street is quiet," Lestrade said, peering out. "Nothing much happens there after 9. "All the better," Holmes murmured. Our adversary prefers quiet places. When the cab stopped before a modest but tidy row of terraced houses, Holmes alighted before the wheels had ceased turning. The door of number 12 bore a small brass plate, Julian Ainsworth, translator. Holmes rapped sharply. We waited. No sound came from within. Lestrade frowned. "He's likely abed." Holmes rapped again, louder this time. Still no answer. Holmes bent, examining the lock and the doorframe. No damage, no sign of forced entry. The neighbouring door opened, slightly, a curious face emerging. "Looking for Mr. Ainsworth?" a woman asked. "He had a caller not an hour ago. Foreign gentleman by the look of him. Tall, dark, very polite." They left together. Holmes's head snapped round. "Left? Together?" "So I believe. I heard Mr. Ainsworth take his hat and coat." They spoke quietly, then went off toward Russell Square. "What time was this?" Holmes asked. "A few minutes before 10, sir." Holmes exchanged a swift glance with me. 10, he murmured. "The hour the telegram was sent. They have taken him." Lestrade stiffened. "Taken him where?" Holmes did not answer. He turned to the woman again. "Madam, did Mr. Ainsworth seem distressed, alarmed?" "No, sir. Just surprised, almost startled. But he went willingly enough." Holmes thanked her with a brief nod and strode quickly to the end of the street, where gas lamps glimmered faintly along the edge of the square. There he paused, surveying the dark, tree-shadowed paths. "Ainsworth leaves with a stranger," he said quietly. A stranger likely possessed of unusual knowledge and perhaps of Indian origin. The second letter was not sent by post. It was delivered by hand. Lestrade's face went pale. "Then the second scream is intended for Ainsworth," Holmes finished. "If they have taken him to a secluded place, we may already be too late." He knelt suddenly, examining the wet pavement beneath the nearest lamp. "Watson, look. Footprints, 2 sets. One lighter, narrower. That must be Ainsworth. The other, heavier, more deliberate. Both leading toward the far side of the square." Lestrade drew his revolver. "Then let's follow them." "Carefully," Holmes said. "Our adversary is ingenious. If he carries a second device, it may be triggered without warning." We advanced through the fog-shrouded square, each footstep muffled by the damp earth. The lamps here were fewer, the shadows deeper. In the distance a carriage rattled, then all was still again. Holmes halted suddenly. "Listen," he whispered. At first I heard nothing but the faint rustle of branches. Then very faintly through the fog, an irregular, intermittent sound, a strained, half-stifled cry. "Holmes!" I whispered urgently. He raised a hand, eyes fixed upon the darkness beneath the great plane trees. "It is not the scream," he murmured, "but it is a voice, Ainsworth's voice. He's still alive. Quick, this way." We hurried across the gravel, turning down a narrow, seldom-used path between overhanging shrubs. The faint sound grew louder, a moan of agitation, fear, perhaps pain. Holmes stopped short. There, beneath the low branches of a yew tree, a figure crouched, Ainsworth, his hands bound, a cloth tied around his mouth, his eyes wild with terror as he struggled against his bonds. Lestrade uttered a cry, but Holmes shot out an arm, holding him back. "Do not touch him," he breathed. "Look at his lap." And I saw it, something small, something wrapped in blue-grey paper, trembling upon the edge of Ainsworth's knees. A sealed envelope, identical in colour to Sir Percival's. Holmes's voice was barely audible. "Careful, Watson, careful. The second letter has already been placed." Ainsworth moaned again, his muffled cry rising in panic. Holmes stepped forward, his hands steady, his eyes fixed upon that terrible object. "One wrong movement," he whispered, "and the scream begins." Ainsworth writhed in desperation, his knees trembling beneath the sinister weight of the envelope. His muffled pleas vibrated through the cloth, tied across his mouth, each sound dangerously close to the sharp movement that might tear the thin paper. Holmes approached with a precision so controlled it seemed scarcely human, his long fingers raised as though he were calming a startled animal rather than a terrified man. "Hold perfectly still," he murmured, the words thin as the fog around us. "Not a breath more than necessary." Lestrade, pale and rigid, stood behind him, revolver still drawn but now useless against a weapon so delicate, so infernal. I could feel my own heartbeat pounding against my ribs, each throb seeming loud enough to trigger some unseen mechanism within the envelope. Holmes crouched slowly, his gaze searching every corner of the folded paper. "Watson," he whispered barely above breath, "look at the seam on the right side." I knelt beside him. Under the faint glow of the gas lamp filtering through the branches, I saw it. The slightest bulge, the tiniest line of unnatural thickness along the fold, something pressed within the envelope's interior. Holmes's face hardened. This is no mere repetition of the first device. It is more advanced, more compact. He raised a hand toward Ainsworth's bound shoulder. "Sir, if you understand me, do not move your legs at all. Keep your breathing shallow." Ainsworth blinked, tears gathering in the corners of his eyes. Holmes continued, his voice acquiring the gentle authority I had heard him use only in moments of dire urgency. "Watson, your knife. Slowly." With great care I drew it from my pocket and placed it, handle first, into Holmes's outstretched hand. He held it like a surgeon preparing for a delicate incision. "This envelope," he murmured, "is held in place by nothing more than friction. If it slips, its contents may engage. We must neutralize it without shifting its center." Lestrade whispered, "Cannot we cut the cords first and remove Ainsworth from it?" Holmes shook his head sharply. "If he jerks even half an inch, he is a dead man. No sudden movement is possible." He lowered the blade to the edge of the envelope. The steel hovered, trembling ever so slightly as his breath touched it. Then in a motion so precise it made my heart lurch, Holmes inserted the very tip of the blade beneath the flap. A faint, scraping sound issued from within the thin paper, a sound no louder than the stroke of a fingernail across silk, yet one that sent a ripple of dread through all three of us. The mechanism was shifting. Holmes froze. He did not even blink. "It is pressure-triggered," he said softly. "Not by the seal, but by the bending of the envelope itself." "What does that mean?" Lestrade whispered hoarsely. "It means," Holmes said, "that I cannot lift the flap. The letter must be steadied from beneath." He looked to me. "Watson, it must be your hands. Mine are already committed." Slide your fingers gently beneath Ainsworth's knees. Support them just enough that I may relieve the tension on the envelope without altering its angle. I felt heat rush to my face. My hands trembled. "Holmes, I fear I may—" "You will not," he said firmly. "Your steadiness has saved more lives in surgery than I could count. Use it now." I swallowed hard and reached forward, guiding my palms under Ainsworth's knees with the utmost delicacy. The translator stiffened, his breath stuttering. Holmes inclined his head a fraction. "Good. Hold him exactly so." Then, moving with the slowness of a leaf drifting downward, Holmes inserted the knife's tip, not at the flap, but at the lower corner, where envelope met the coarse fabric of Ainsworth's trousers. "Lestrade," he said through barely parted lips, "place your hand upon Ainsworth's shoulder. If he feels faint, he must not slump." Lestrade obeyed, beads of sweat glistening on his brow. Holmes slid the blade inward another fraction of an inch. A soft, metallic tremor issued from within, a sinister, quivering hum, as though something alive had stirred. Ainsworth began to whimper through the cloth. Holmes's voice was not raised, yet it struck like a whip. "Absolute stillness, sir. Another 10 seconds. He closed his eyes, as if committing the action to pure instinct, then pressed the knife upward, slicing the lower seam. The paper parted. A shape gleamed within, a small brass chamber, no larger than a walnut, wound about with the tightest steel spring I had ever seen. Holmes's face settled into grim resolve. "There," he said quietly. A harmonic whistle, reeds cut to vibrate at impossible pitch, a spring under tension. One more shift of weight and this forest would ring with a sound enough to stop a man's heart. He slid the knife beneath the device, lifting it as delicately as one might extract a spider's egg sac. "Watson, maintain your support." I held my breath. Holmes lifted the device free at last. The instant it left Ainsworth's lap, Lestrade sealed both hands upon the man's shoulders, pulling him backward while Holmes placed the mechanism upon the damp gravel and stepped sharply away. For 3 full seconds, none of us moved. Then Holmes exhaled and straightened. "Safe," he said simply. Lestrade let out a shuddering breath and tore the gag from Ainsworth's mouth. The poor man collapsed backward, inhaling in ragged sobs. Holmes crouched beside him. "Mr. Ainsworth, are you injured?" Ainsworth shook his head weakly. No, sir. But that man, he said if I moved, I would be shrieking my last breath into the night." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Describe him!" "Tall," Ainsworth gasped. "Thin, dark-skinned, a faint scar along his jaw. Spoke English beautifully. He said Sir Percival had wronged many, but that this message was not for the world, it was for him." Holmes exchanged a lightning-fast glance with me. "The engineer," he murmured. "Aaron Varmer." Ainsworth nodded frantically. "He said the first device was a warning, the second a demonstration, that he sought not death but retribution through fear." "But why you?" Lestrade demanded. Ainsworth clutched his chest. Because I translated the correspondences between Sir Percival and certain Indian petitioners. He believed I distorted the meaning to favour the judge." Holmes rose abruptly. "Lestrade, guard Ainsworth. Watson and I must deal with the device." Lestrade's eyes widened. "Deal with it? Holmes, you're mad if you intend to—" Holmes ignored him. He examined the brass chamber, now resting harmlessly upon the path. "The mechanism is active but not armed. It must be wound fully to emit the scream." Varmer intended Ainsworth's motion to complete the tension. "And now?" I asked softly. Holmes looked at the device with something like respect. "Now it is a clue. Every cut, every gear will tell us something of its maker, and if we act quickly, we may yet catch him before he realizes his second attempt has failed." Ainsworth seized Holmes's sleeve with trembling fingers. He said he would return before midnight to hear the scream." Holmes's eyes narrowed to slits. "Then," he said, pocketing the device carefully, "we have an appointment to keep." We helped Ainsworth to his feet, and Lestrade supported him as we moved toward the square's edge. Holmes paused once, glancing back to the shadowed path, as though reading the night itself. "Watson," he murmured as we walked, "our adversary grows bolder. His next move will not be so forgiving." The fog thickened around us. Midnight was approaching. Holmes set a brisk pace as we escorted Ainsworth from the square, his mind clearly racing ahead of us. Lestrade, supporting the trembling translator, kept glancing over his shoulder as though expecting at any moment to see a tall figure with a scarred jaw emerging from the fog. The night was growing colder. The mist clung to our coats like damp fingers. "We must get you somewhere safe," Holmes said to Ainsworth, but not so far removed that we lose the trail of our quarry. Ainsworth shuddered. He said he would be listening, that he would hear if the device activated. Precisely, Holmes replied, which means he is near.
Perhaps very near indeed. At the mouth of the square, Holmes stopped abruptly. Lestrade, take Mr. Ainsworth to the cab stand by Russell Street. 2 constables should escort him to Scotland Yard. Do not allow him out of sight for an instant. Whatever happens next, he must be protected. Lestrade bristled. And you? Are you planning to confront this devil alone? Holmes turned, and in the lamplight his expression was sharper, colder than I had yet seen it in this affair. Alone? No, I shall have Watson. I swallowed but nodded, for the tone of his voice admitted no alternative. You believe Varma will return here? I asked quietly. Holmes shook his head. Not here, but he will return to watch. A man who crafts a device meant to kill through terror will not simply abandon his vantage point. He will want to witness the result, hear it, if nothing else. And so long as he believes the device remains primed upon Ainsworth's lap, he will linger close enough to detect its activation. Lestrade hesitated, then clapped Holmes's shoulder. Very well, but I'll send men back here as soon as Ainsworth is secured. Do so, Holmes said, already turning away. Once they had vanished into the fog, Holmes grasped my arm lightly. Watson, consider what we know. Varma lured Ainsworth out on the pretext of some important matter. He placed the letter upon his lap, restrained him, and left him in the belief the device would engage upon the slightest motion. He intended to listen for the scream. Therefore, he must have hidden himself nearby, I finished. Just so. Holmes gestured broadly at the square. The man is patient, ingenious. He would require a vantage point with cover. Somewhere dark, close enough to hear any faint beginnings of the mechanism, yet not so near as to be discovered by a casual passer-by. His gaze swept across the benches, the clusters of shrubbery, the tall yew trees forming shadows like black curtains. But why not remain to watch the outcome? I asked. Holmes's lips compressed. Because the danger of proximity was too great. Once the mechanism screamed, the reaction would be immediate. Windows would fling open, constables would descend, the neighborhood would rouse. He needed to be close, but not trapped. He moved toward the side of the square opposite where we had rescued Ainsworth. Varma would choose height, Holmes murmured. Somewhere above ground level where sound travels cleanest. Watson, look. He pointed to a narrow, grimy staircase at the side of a tobacconist's shop, half concealed behind an iron railing. A faint light burned in one of the upper windows above. A lodging house, I said. Exactly. Cheap rooms for temporary residents. He would blend into such a place without difficulty. Holmes ascended the steps noiselessly, and I followed. The door at the top was ajar, a faintly flickering gas lamp illuminating a narrow corridor. Holmes paused, listening. A murmur of sound, barely perceptible, came from a room 2 doors down. Not a voice, but the faint shift of weight upon floorboards. Holmes's eyes gleamed. He's here, he whispered. Watson, follow my lead, and silently, if you please. He approached the door, crouched slightly, and examined its keyhole. A yellow glow flickered inside, and a shadow moved across the wall. Holmes eased the door open a fraction of an inch. The room beyond was small and poorly furnished. A man stood at the window, half veiled by the curtains, leaning forward as though straining to hear some distant sound. His silhouette was unmistakable, tall, thin, the head held at an angular tilt. And when he turned fractionally, I glimpsed the faint scar that ran along his jawline. Holmes exhaled through his nose, a sound of quiet triumph. Varma, he whispered. He pushed the door wider. A floorboard creaked under my shoe. Varma spun, eyes flashing, hand diving beneath his coat. Holmes lunged forward, seizing his wrist before the man could draw whatever device or weapon he concealed. The struggle was sudden, vicious, and startlingly silent. Varma fought like a man accustomed to danger, his movements lithe and precise, but Holmes had the advantage of surprise, and his grip was iron. They grappled, twisting toward the center of the room. "Watson!" Holmes barked. I leapt forward and grabbed Varma's other arm. He snarled, an oddly controlled sound, and was forced backward against the bed. Holmes wrenched the concealed object from his grasp. It was not a knife, nor a gun. It was a slender, tubular instrument of brass, fitted with a small winding lever, another infernal device. Holmes held it up with a grim smile. "A manual version," he said. "Portable, likely capable of producing the same dreadful resonance." Varma ceased struggling abruptly. His dark eyes fixed upon Holmes with a curious intensity. "You have interfered," he said, in a low, calm voice. "I warned you. The first was justice, the second mercy, but you do not understand the sound of judgment." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "I understand you entirely. You sought to kill through terror, not force. The scream was your executioner." Varma's lips curved slightly. "Fear is more powerful than bullets. A man's heart betrays him more swiftly than any poison." "You believed Sir Percival deserved death," Holmes said coldly. "But Mr. Ainsworth, what of his crime?" "He twisted our language," Varma hissed. "He made justice into mockery. Sir Percival condemned a man because Ainsworth's translation suggested malice where there was none." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "So your motive is retribution for a miscarriage of justice?" "Not retribution," Varma hissed. "Correction." Holmes stepped back, releasing his hold, though I kept a firm grip on Varma's other arm. "You will come with us," Holmes said. Varma's expression shifted, an unexpected softness flickering across his features. "You cannot stop the sound," he murmured. Before I understood the meaning of his words, Holmes's gaze darted sharply to the window. A sound, faint, metallic, like the whisper of a tuning fork awakening. Holmes moved first, snatching the brass tube from the table and twisting its lever backward in a single, rapid motion. The hum stopped. Varma sagged in our grip, defeated. Holmes exhaled slowly. "That," he murmured, "was very nearly the third." Lestrade's heavy boots thundered up the stairs outside. Holmes turned to me with a weariness I had seldom seen upon him, though his eyes still shone with fierce, burning clarity. "We have him, Watson," he said. "But the machinery of this case is far from spent." For the first time since the night began, I realized what he meant. We had captured the man, but not yet the truth. Lestrade burst into the room with 2 constables in his wake, their boots skidding slightly on the warped floorboards as they took in the scene. Varma pinned between Holmes and myself, the brass instrument gleaming ominously in Holmes's grip. A flicker of professional pride crossed Lestrade's face, but it vanished almost immediately, replaced by wary confusion. "Good Lord," he breathed. "Is this the devil who made that cursed thing?" Holmes stepped back, allowing the constables to seize Varma. "Secure him," he said sharply, "but do not handle him roughly. He is dangerous, not because of strength, but because of knowledge." Varma did not resist. He held himself upright, breathing steadily, his dark eyes fixed on Holmes with an unnervingly calm intensity. "You think you have captured the cause," he murmured, "but you have seized only the echo." Lestrade frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Holmes's gaze narrowed. "It means," he said quietly, "that his motive is not yet fully revealed.
Varma inclines his head slightly. Sir Percival was not the first to receive a letter, he said. Only the first whose heart betrayed him. Lestrade stiffened. Not the... What do you mean by that? Holmes's voice was suddenly ice. Explain yourself. Varma's lips curved in a faint, cryptic smile. A machine perfects itself through failure. Before a design can punish the guilty, it must test the innocent. Sir Percival saw himself as judge. He died as judged. Lestrade swore under his breath. Holmes! The man's mad! But Holmes held up a hand. No, Varma speaks as an engineer. He tests assumptions as one tests pistons or gears. Varma's eyes gleamed. At last, someone understands. Holmes stepped forward, meeting his gaze fully. Your devices? How many? Varma hesitated. Only for a heartbeat, but I saw Holmes catch it. Answer, Holmes said, low and commanding. 3, Varma said. The first 2 you have disarmed. The third you will not. Lestrade's hand flew to his revolver. Where is it? Varma lifted his chin. Already sent. A chill swept through the room like a sudden draught. Holmes's jaw tightened. To whom? Varma merely closed his eyes. To the one who stands behind the curtain of justice. The one whose pen ended more lives than Sir Percival ever condemned. Holmes seized him by the collar. Name him. But Varma only exhaled slowly, serenely, as though even capture had fulfilled some private purpose. You will discover it, he said, but too late. The constables dragged him from the room. Varma did not struggle, not once. His calmness, his eerie composure, unsettled me far more than resistance would have. When the door slammed behind them, Holmes stood still for several long seconds, the brass instrument dangling from his hand. The flickering lamplight cast sharp shadows across his features, accentuating the pallor that crept over him. Holmes, I said softly. Who do you believe he meant? Holmes turned in a sudden, swift motion, his coat swinging behind him like the wing of some dark bird. Watson, he said, fetch my coat, quickly. We return to Baker Street at once. You already know? I whispered. Don't you? He paused at the doorway, and for the first time that night, the mask of complete composure slipped, just for an instant. I fear, he said quietly, that I do. But he said nothing more until we had descended the narrow staircase and emerged once more into the damp gloom of the square. The fog had thickened to a heavy curtain, swallowing the lamplight and distorting the shapes of distant buildings. Holmes signalled to a cab with a forceful gesture. The driver, startled by our sudden arrival, pulled up sharply. Inside, Holmes gripped the window edge with pale knuckles, his mind clearly in furious motion. Watson, he said suddenly, recall Varma's wording. He spoke not of personal vendetta toward Ainsworth, but of distorted justice. He sees himself as a corrective force. Therefore, his third target must be one whom he perceives as the greatest corrupter of truth. A judge, I suggested. Holmes shook his head vehemently. Sir Percival was but one magistrate, Ainsworth the translator, but neither held true power. Who lies behind the curtain? Who has the unseen hand in colonial judicial decisions, in the selection of cases, in the shaping of legal outcomes? He turned fully toward me. A legal architect, Watson, a man whose influence directs the entire machinery. A lawmaker? A draftsman, Holmes said, a framer of colonial codes, or a reviser of them. Suddenly he tensed. Watson, do you recall the ledger? There was one more name, one whose influence spanned both continents, one who oversaw the legal framework Sir Percival merely executed. Yes, Rowan, I said. Sir Gilbert Rowan. Holmes nodded sharply. Exactly, retired, yet widely respected, still advising. The Colonial Office, and most critically, he resides at Montague Place. Not far, I said. "Barely a mile." Holmes rapped sharply on the cab wall. "Driver, Montague Place, as fast as your horse can manage." The wheels leapt into motion. Holmes turned to me, his expression deadly serious. "If Varma has sent the third device to Rowan, we have minutes at best. The device may already be in his hands." I felt a knot tightens in my stomach. "But if Rowan opens it—" Holmes closed his eyes briefly. "His age, his weak lungs. It would kill him, Watson, not merely terrify him. Varma's test is complete. Now he means to strike true." Fog whipped past the cab windows, the horse panting as it strained against its harness. Holmes gripped the edge of the seat. "The scream," he murmured, "is more than sound. It is the culmination of Varma's design. He believes he punishes corruption by the very instrument Rowan once used. Words twisted into injustice." "Holmes," I said, "Rowan may already have opened the envelope." Holmes's eyes snapped open. "Not if Varma kept to his pattern," he said fiercely. "He delivers by hand. It is late. Rowan would be in his study, perhaps preparing correspondence. The letter will be on his desk." The cab lurched around a corner. The fog parted momentarily to reveal a row of elegant Georgian houses, Montague Place. Holmes was out of the cab before the wheels stopped turning. I followed him up the steps, scarcely able to keep pace as he hammered upon the door. "No time!" he shouted. "Open in the Queen's name!" An elderly butler appeared, startled and blinking. Holmes pushed past him. "Where is Sir Gilbert?" In his study, sir, but—" Holmes did not wait. He ran down the corridor, wrenching open the study door, and I stopped short behind him. Sir Gilbert Rowan sat at his desk, spectacles perched low upon his nose. Before him lay an opened envelope. Holmes inhaled sharply, but Rowan looked up with mild surprise. "Oh, Mr. Holmes, is it? What brings you—" Holmes darted forward. "Don't move!" Rowan froze. Holmes snatched the letter from the desk. I expected to see brass, steel, a deadly, compact mechanism, but the paper was empty, nothing hidden within, nothing weighted, nothing armed. Holmes stared. "It's blank," I whispered. Holmes's brows drew together. Rowan adjusted his spectacles. "It arrived an hour ago. Curious thing, no signature. No writing, poor stationery too. I thought it a mistake." Holmes turned the envelope over, once, twice. A thin line of ink caught his eye. 3 words. Holmes went very still. "Watson, read." I leaned forward. In an elegant looping hand, "This is not justice." No device, no scream, just a message. Holmes straightened slowly, his face unreadable. "Watson," he whispered, "Varma lied." My heart pounded. Then why claim a third device? Holmes looked toward the window into the thick, silent fog. "To conceal his true move," he said, "Varma's final act is not death, but revelation." I felt a chill run through me. "Holmes, what revelation?" Holmes's eyes hardened, cold as steel. "The truth," he said, "but not the truth we expect." Outside, a distant sound drifted through the fog, unsettling, hollow, and unmistakably metallic. Holmes spun toward the door. "Watson, something is beginning." Holmes was already halfway down the corridor before I had fully registered the metallic resonance drifting through the night air. It came again, faint, distant, not the terrible shriek we had come to dread, but a thin, oscillating tremor, as though some unseen tuning fork had been struck high above the city. Rowan called after us in confusion, but Holmes did not pause. He reached the front door in 3 strides, wrenched it open, and stepped into the dense fog. The street lamps glowed like blurred embers, their halos bleeding into the mist. "Holmes!" I cried, nearly stumbling down the steps after him. "What is it? If Varma lied about the third device—" "He did not lie," Holmes snapped. "He misdirected. That is far more dangerous." "But Sir Gilbert received no mechanism, only the message." "Exactly," Holmes said. spinning so suddenly I nearly collided with him. Varma wanted us to believe Rowan was the final target. He wanted us to pour our energies into preventing a crime that was never intended, not against Rowan. But why send the message at all? Holmes's gaze cut through the fog like a blade. To remove Rowan from suspicion, Watson, to make us believe the third act was merely symbolic. Meanwhile, the metallic tremor sounded again, louder this time. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Meanwhile, the true device is being activated elsewhere. A carriage rumbled faintly in the distance, and with it came a new sound, indistinct voices, the patter of hurried footsteps. Holmes seized my arm. "Come, we must gain elevation. The sound travels from the north side of the square." We sprinted along Montague Place, our footsteps muffled by the wet pavement. As we reached the corner, Holmes abruptly halted beside a tall townhouse whose second-floor balcony overlooked the rooftops. "Up," he said with a curt gesture. "We may see something from the height." We climbed the iron staircase 2 at a time. At the top, Holmes leaned over the balustrade, scanning the fog-swathed skyline. "There," he breathed. "Do you see it?" At first, I saw only haze. Then, through a thin slit in the fog, a faint glimmer, like a lantern swaying from a distant rooftop. Holmes's posture tensed. He has chosen a location of vantage, not one of residence. "Varma escaped?" I gasped. Holmes shook his head. "No, Varma is in custody, but his work, his orchestration, is not yet complete. The third device is not meant for a single man. It is meant for an
audience." My heart lurched. "Holmes, you don't mean London?" "Not in the sense of mass harm," Holmes said, "but in spectacle, in symbolism, a scream heard across the rooftops, an accusation hurled upon the fog itself." "Varma promised revelation, Watson. That means he intends a message no one can ignore." He leapt back down the stair at once. I followed, breathless. When we reached street level, Holmes turned sharply and began running northward toward the open expanse of Russell Square. "Holmes, how can a device be triggered without Varma present?" Holmes replied, without breaking stride. "Varma is a mechanist of extraordinary ability. Springs may be delayed, whistles may be rigged to wind by temperature shifts, or—" He stopped so suddenly I nearly crashed into him. "May have been activated earlier this evening by someone entirely unaware." A single dreadful thought struck me. "Holmes, Rowan?" "No," Holmes said. "Rowan's letter was a blind. Think, who else has touched the earlier devices? Who else handled their wreckage?" I froze. "Holmes, you." He gave me a swift, sharp look. "I suspected as much when the second device trembled on Ainsworth's lap. Varma studied my involvement carefully, but he would not waste his third design on me, not when I am prepared." "Then who?" A faint shout cut through the fog. We turned toward it instinctively. Lestrade was running full tilt toward us from the far corner of the square, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Holmes!" he choked out. "Thank heaven, you must hurry! They found something at the yard!" Holmes stiffened. "Something?" Lestrade nodded, struggling to breathe. "A box addressed to me. To me, Holmes. They opened it at the desk sergeant's table. God help us, none of us knew." "The yard," Holmes whispered, the realization slamming into him like a physical blow. Varma knew Lestrade would bring the captured devices there. He knew the wreckage would be examined. He hid the third among the false trails, sent under Lestrade's own name. Lestrade's eyes were wide with terror. "Holmes, the sergeant! He said he heard a humming, faint, like metal vibrating, before he sent me running to fetch you." "That is the priming mechanism," Holmes said. "We have minutes, perhaps seconds." Lestrade grabbed his sleeve. "Holmes, there are 20 men on duty tonight. Clerks, constables, if that thing screams—" Holmes tore free. "We must reach the yard at once. Watson, come." We sprinted down the fog-drowned street as though the very air were aflame. A hansom clattered by, and Holmes seized the bridle. "Scotland Yard!" he roared. "Drive as if Lucifer himself were at your heels." The driver, startled into obedience, snapped the reins. The horse bolted forward, wheels skidding dangerously on the slick stones. Lestrade clung to the side rail, teeth clenched. Holmes stood
upright, gripping the roof for balance, eyes fixed ahead with an intensity that chilled me more than the night air. "Holmes," I gasped, "can the device be disarmed?" "Only if I reach it before the spring reaches full tension," he said, through clenched teeth. "If the reed begins its resonance, if even the first frequency is struck, it will be too late." "How long do we have?" Holmes closed his eyes as though calculating the motion of unseen gears. "Not long." Fog swallowed the cab again. The horse snorted, foam spraying from its bit. Lamps blurred into streaks as we tore through the city. Then suddenly the outline of Scotland Yard emerged through the mist, and from somewhere within its walls came a faint sound, a thin, rising hum. Holmes vaulted from the cab before it fully stopped. Lestrade and I followed, stumbling through the doorway into the ground-floor corridor. Officers scattered at the sight of Holmes's expression. "Where is the box?" he demanded. "In the evidence room," a constable cried. "Sir, there is a sound coming from—" Holmes did not wait. He ran down the hallway, turned sharply left, and burst through the door to the evidence room. Just as the hum sharpened, the box lay on the central table. A small brass cylinder protruded through torn wrappings, trembling with the dreadful promise of activation. Holmes froze, every muscle coiled, every calculation compressed into a single heartbeat. Then he moved. Holmes lunged forward with a swiftness that defied reason. One moment he was motionless, tense as a drawn bowstring. The next he had crossed the room in a single, fluid arc. His hand shot out, seizing the brass cylinder, even as the hum rose to an eerie pitch that made the very air quiver. "Back!" Holmes commanded, his voice startling in its calm authority. Lestrade and I obeyed instantly, retreating behind the thick support column near the evidence room door. Two clerks scrambled out after us, pale with terror. Holmes remained alone with the device. The hum climbed, vibrating through the table, the floorboards, and even the walls. The sound teetered on the edge of something monstrous, something shrill and unearthly that might erupt at any instant into the deadly scream we had already witnessed in Sir Percival's case. Holmes pressed the device to his ear. His eyes narrowed. "Watson," he called. "It is nearly at full tension. The spring is overwound. It will engage in seconds." My heart hammered painfully. "Holmes, what can be done?" "There is a failsafe," he said tightly. "Varma would never build a device he could not silence. The question is, did he leave the mechanism intact?" His fingers traced the brass, searching for some minute detail, known only to the craftsman who built it. His hands, which could be so steady in times of terrible crisis, moved with the delicacy of a clockmaker. Removing the reed by force would be suicide. Breaking the spring would trigger the release. Opening the chamber was impossible with seconds to spare. I watched helplessly, breath held. The hum rose again, vibrating the glass jars in the cabinet, making dust leap from the rafters. It brushed the edge of the scream, the terrible resonance capable of shattering a man's composure and perhaps even his heart. Holmes suddenly turned the cylinder, aligning two barely visible grooves. "There," he murmured. "Varma, you ingenious devil." With a decisive twist so precise that even a hair's breadth error might have meant catastrophe, Holmes pressed in the narrow indentation and rotated the lever backward. The hum wavered again, and stopped. A dead, Unnatural silence fell, so profound it rang in my ears. Holmes exhaled slowly and placed the device on the table. For a moment he stood motionless, his head bowed, his thin frame trembling. Not with fear, but with the staggering exertion of the past seconds, Lestrade rushed forward. "Holmes! Are you hurt?" Holmes straightened, his face pale but composed. No, though I should not care to repeat the experience. The constables who had fled returned cautiously, peering around the doorway. Holmes gestured sharply. "No one is to touch that cylinder. I shall dismantle it myself. See that it remains under constant guard." Lestrade nodded, still visibly shaken. "Holmes, I owe you the lives of every man in this building. The Yard itself, Lord save us, could have been the victim of that thing." Holmes gave a faint, weary smile. Varma did not intend an indiscriminate slaughter. Terror was his weapon, symbolism his purpose. He wanted to strike at what he perceived as the heart of corruption, and in his mind that heart resided here. "And in me," Lestrade murmured, staring at the wrappings bearing his name. "God, Holmes, why?" Holmes placed a hand on the inspector's shoulder. "Not you as a man, Lestrade, but as a representative. Varma believed the Yard complicit in the injustices he sought to expose. You were merely the most prominent target." Lestrade swallowed hard. "Well, he's wrong. We serve the law." Holmes's gaze softened, not with sentiment, but with a certain grim sympathy. Human institutions make human errors. Varma sought to punish errors with terror. That alone ensures he will face justice in a court of law, not at the end of a scream. A clerk suddenly approached, tentative and shaken. "Mr. Holmes, sir." "Superintendent Briggs wishes to see you immediately. He's gathered statements from Varma, and there's something you ought to hear." Holmes nodded. "Very well." He turned to me. "Watson, come." We crossed the corridor and entered the superintendent's office, where Briggs, a heavy-set man with stern features, looked up from a sheaf of notes. "Holmes," he said gravely, "during initial questioning, Varma said something peculiar." Holmes folded his arms. "Peculiar is a generous term for his philosophy." Briggs slid a paper across the desk. "He insists Sir Percival was not his true enemy, nor Ainsworth, nor Rowan. He claims the true architect of injustice, his words, not mine, is someone who has yet to be named." Holmes's eyes sharpened instantly. "Yet to be named?" Briggs nodded. "He says there is a man still walking free, whose manipulations caused the wrongful conviction that set all this in motion, someone who profited from the verdict." Holmes went very, very still. "A benefactor?" he murmured. "Varma says this man sent Sir Percival false documents," Briggs said. "Evidence forged to tilt the case, evidence Ainsworth mistranslated, evidence Rowan approved. Varma claims this man was never discovered, and that his guilt outweighs all others." My breath caught. "Holmes! Can he be believed?" Holmes's face darkened like a storm cloud. "Oh yes," he said quietly. "Varma might be blinded by obsession, but he is no liar. If he says a puppeteer hid behind the curtain, then there was one." Briggs leaned forward. "He gave a name, or part of one." Holmes's hand curled slowly at his side. "Well?" Briggs hesitated, then read aloud, "Harrowby." I gasped. "Sir Percival himself?" Briggs shook his head. "Varma said Harrowby, but then corrected himself. Said he meant someone linked to Harrowby, someone whose prosperity was tied to the verdict." Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden, terrible clarity. "Not Sir Percival," he said. "His brother." "Harrowby's brother?" I repeated. "But the judge lived alone. He—" Holmes cut me off. "Not by blood, by alliance, through marriage." He paced once, then stopped dead. Watson, recall the early report. Sir Percival had a nephew, mentioned in passing, a man who handled many of the judge's affairs, a man who stood to inherit. I searched my memory frantically, and then I remembered. Holmes tapped the desk sharply. Percival Harrowby's nephew, Leonard Harrowby, a solicitor, a man with access to documents, with motive to manipulate outcomes, and with everything to gain from Sir Percival's influence. Briggs's eyes widened. You believe he forged evidence in the Indian case? I believe, Holmes said coldly, that Leonard Harrowby manipulated the case for his own benefit. Sir Percival executed the verdict. Ainsworth translated its foundation. Rowan approved its legality, but Leonard Harrowby planted the seed. Lestrade's voice echoed from the doorway, strained and breathless. Holmes, Harrowby's house is near the temple. If what Varma says is true, Holmes was already striding past him. Then, he said, we have one final journey tonight. Holmes, I said, rushing after him, what do you intend to do? He paused at the entrance, the fog curling around him like a shroud. To reveal the man who orchestrated this tragedy from the shadows, he said. And Watson, his voice lowered, to confront the only true villain in this case. We stepped once more into the midnight mist. The final thread, at last, had appeared, and Holmes was ready to pull it. It was not long before we were once more rattling through the London streets, this time heading citywards, the horse's breath smoking in the chill air as we made for the temple. Holmes sat forward, his profile sharp against the murky glow beyond the window, his eyes distant yet burning with a cold determination. You will observe, Watson, said he at last, that every step Varma took in this affair points, not to mere vengeance, but to an accusation. Sir Percival, Ainsworth, Rowan, the yard itself, each, in his view, played a part. Yet behind them all stood one, unseen, who profited most from the original injustice. Leonard Harrowby, I murmured. The nephew? Precisely. A solicitor with access to colonial records, drafts of petitions, and the financial aftermath of legal decisions. If a case, properly decided, threatened his interests, how simple to tilt the balance with a forged affidavit, a misrepresented deed, a mistranslated deposition. Sir Percival, believing he acted upon sound evidence, becomes, unknowingly, the instrument of another man's greed. And Varma discovered this? Holmes gave a dry little shrug. Engineers are observers, Watson. After his conviction, he would examine line by line the case that condemned him, or his associates. Sooner or later, he must have perceived discrepancies where only deliberate malice could account for them. But by then it was too late. Sir Percival's name lay upon the judgment. Leonard Harrowby's lay upon nothing at all. Hence the screaming letters. Lestrade shifted on the opposite seat, his face grim in the half-light. And if you're wrong, Holmes, if this is all conjecture? Holmes's voice was very quiet. Then Leonard Harrowby will show us a blameless record and a clear conscience, but I do not often knock at a man's door without reason. The cab drew up at last, before a sombre range of chambers near the temple, respectable, gloomy, with a single lamp burning behind a blind on the first floor. Holmes was up the steps in an instant, his long arm reaching for the bell pull. Lestrade and I came close behind. The door was opened by a small, sallow clerk with ink-stained fingers. "Mr. Leonard Harrowby?" asked Holmes. "Mr. Harrowby is in conference, sir. If you would be good enough to call it Holmes's card," and Lestrade's warrant flashed before the man's eyes in the same moment. "Scotland Yard," growled Lestrade. "Now, we'll see him now." The clerk faltered, then stepped aside. We passed along a narrow passage to a door at the end, upon which the name Leonard Harrowby, solicitor, was neatly painted. Holmes did not knock. He opened the door and entered. Harrowby was standing by the hearth, a bundle of papers in his hand, the edges singed and curling in the grate. He was a man of perhaps 35, well-dressed, with features refined but hard at the mouth. At the sight of us he started violently, the documents dropping from his fingers. "Who are—" "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" Holmes closed the door behind us and leaned lightly against it, his grey eyes fixed upon the other's pale face. "Good evening, Mr. Harrowby. My name is Sherlock Holmes. You have heard it, perhaps, from your late uncle." "My—" Harrowby's lips twitched. "My uncle is dead. If you come about his affairs, you must see me in business hours." "We come," said Holmes, "about a case which began many years ago in Bengal and which has at last reached its proper courtroom." Harrowby licked his lips. "I do not know what you mean." "Let me refresh your memory. There was a land dispute, native cultivators, a merchant syndicate, a certain engineer named Arun Varma who gave evidence for the former. Their title was clear, their cause, by all accounts, just. Yet, at the 11th hour, a new document appeared, an agreement in English purporting to cede certain rights. Sir Percival admitted it, Ainsworth translated it, Rowan upheld it, the natives lost, and someone somewhere gained a lucrative interest." Lestrade stepped forward, his eyes hard. "Varma says that someone was you." Harrowby's hands clenched at his sides. "The man is a convicted criminal. His lies are worth nothing." Holmes stooped to the grate and, with the tongs, drew out the bundle of scorched papers. He shook off a few cinders and held them up. "You were burning correspondence when we entered, Mr. Harrowby. One might almost suspect a guilty conscience. Let us see what was not meant for the fire." He spread the pages upon the desk. Even in their damaged state, certain signatures and names stood forth, black against the browned paper. I saw the words Varma and Co. upon one letterhead, and beneath it a scrawled urgent script. Holmes's finger touched it lightly. "A letter from our ingenious mechanist," he observed. "You knew him long before his devices began to scream in Bloomsbury." Harrowby shot him a venomous glance. "Business correspondence, nothing more." "Oh, indeed?" Holmes's tone grew suddenly cutting. "Then it is curious that he writes, 'If you persist in refusing me restitution, I shall take my case to the very men whose verdict you bought.' Curious, too, that he refers to the false deed you yourself dictated, and, I foolishly believed, would never be used." "Very curious, Mr. Harrowby." Lestrade gave a low whistle. "Bought verdicts, false deeds. You're in deep water, sir." Harrowby's composure cracked. "I did nothing that others have not done," he cried hoarsely. "The natives had no standing in law. The land was wasted. My uncle's judgment gave it value. And what thanks did he receive? Threats, petitions, insults in pamphlets. Those men would have ruined him if I had not acted." "You acted," said Holmes coldly, "by forging a deed, suborning a translator by subtle misrepresentation, and using your uncle's authority to sanctify a theft. When Varma discovered the truth, you left him to rot in prison. He had no proof which would avail him. You had the law and your uncle's name. It was an unequal struggle." Harrowby's shoulders slumped. He is a fanatic. He would not be satisfied with money. He wanted my uncle's reputation, mine, everything, dragged through the mud. Better he waste his life on impossible devices than succeed in that. Holmes's eyes flashed. And yet his devices very nearly killed a judge, a translator, and half the men at Scotland Yard. You, Mr. Harrowby, built the original injustice. Varma built the scream that followed it. Between you, you turned law into a chamber of horrors. Lestrade laid a heavy hand upon Harrowby's arm. "Leonard Harrowby, I'm arresting you on suspicion of forgery, conspiracy to pervert the course of justice, and any further crimes the Crown chooses to add. You may say now whatever you think will help you, but I'd not wager much on your chances." Harrowby sagged, a man suddenly shorn of all support. "He will not be believed," he muttered. "It is his word against mine." Holmes's voice, for all its quiet tones, cut like a knife. "No, Mr. Harrowby, it is not merely his word. There are the papers Varma preserved, the financial records of the syndicate you enriched, the letters you failed to burn in time, the trail of payments and favours that runs from their coffers to your accounts. Varma's scream was a crude instrument. Mine is a subtler one. I prefer the sound of evidence." For an instant there was silence, save for the crackle of dying embers. Then Lestrade led Leonard Harrowby away. It was near dawn when Holmes and I at last returned to Baker Street. A thin grey light seeped around the edges of the curtains, and the familiar sitting room, with its litter of books and chemical apparatus, seemed doubly welcome after the turmoil of that long night. Holmes threw himself into his armchair, long limbs extended, hands clasped before him. "You are exhausted, my dear Holmes," said I, for the strain had marked him more deeply than I had seen in some time. He smiled faintly. "A little. It is not the physical exertion, you understand, but the noise. One grows tired of listening to the world scream, even when the scream is only potential." My gaze drifted to the table where the disarmed brass cylinders lay side by side, their springs loosened, their reeds removed. Without the tension that had once coiled within them, they were nothing more than shells, harmless curiosities. "And Varma?" I asked. "What will be his fate?" Holmes's eyes followed mine to the table. "He will stand trial. His guilt in the construction and deployment of those devices is beyond doubt. But when the full history of the case is laid before the court, the forged deed, the perverted judgment, the wasted petitions, I suspect the sentence may be tempered. The law is harsh, Watson, but it is not always deaf." "And Harrowby?" "For him," said Holmes quietly, "I foresee no such tempering. His was the cold crime, the patient, calculating corruption. Varma's scream was born of a sense of injustice, misguided, unlawful, murderous, if you will, but still reacting against a wrong. Harrowby's work had no such excuse. He built the wrong." I sat in silence for a moment. "The letter that screamed in the night," I said at last. "It seems now a strange instrument for conscience." Holmes gave a dry chuckle. "Conscience rarely speaks so clearly, my dear Watson. If it did, I should be out of a profession. No, the true moral of this case is that when men warp the law for their own ends, they create in others a desperation that may take monstrous form. Varma chose machinery. Another might choose dynamite. A third, slander. It is all noise in the end." "And you," I ventured. "You silenced the noise." He shook his head, his eyes half closed. "I did what I could to prevent needless death. That is all. The scream would never have existed had the first pen stroke been honest. Remember that when you set this down, Watson, the mechanism is ingenious, the device is dramatic, but the true villainy lay in a few quiet words on a false document." He reached for his pipe, then seemed to think better of it, and instead picked up one of the gutted cylinders, turning it thoughtfully between his long fingers. "A pretty toy," he remarked. "When stripped of its sting, almost admirable. Perhaps one day some harmless application will be found for such acoustics. An alarm, a signal, a maritime beacon. It is not always the invention that is wicked, but the hand that wields it." "And you, Holmes," I said, unable to suppress a smile, "you have wielded your mind tonight as deftly as any craftsman his tools." He looked up at me with that sudden, boyish twinkle I had seen so often. "My dear Watson, if you persist in such remarks, I shall be forced to recommend you for a post at the Yard. They could do with a little admiration there. As for me, I am content with a cup of coffee and 2 hours of sleep. The Empire, I believe, will manage to survive without us until noon." With that he rose, stretched his long arms, and moved toward his room, leaving me with the quiet dawn, the gutted, screaming letters, and the curious comfort of knowing that for all its flaws and failings, justice had at last been made to speak more clearly than terror.